colleagues who may be joining us today. Also pay my respects to emerging leaders who I look forward to working with into the future. Today we've got three presenters, and we're just awaiting Pat Sparrow, CEO of Aged and Community Services. We are just also waiting Gerard Mansour to join us. And we have with us David Sykes, Director of the Centre for Dementia Learning, Australia. So given this is only an hour's webinar, we might in fact start with David's presentation and wait for, and then we'll wait for Gerard and Pat to join us. So can I thank David for taking the time out today to present to us, and given the time, I'll just hand straight over to David. Thank you.
Thanks, Viv, and I'm just going to share screen, so let's see if I can get that working for us. Can you all see that slide that I've just put up now?
Yes,
yep.
We can, yes.
Good. All right, so look, given we've only got a short amount of time this morning, what I've decided to do is just put together a fairly short slide pack, which will go into more detail than what I'm going to cover off today, given I've only got 10 minutes with you. So I just really wanted to probably skip across the mountaintops. There's more specific strategies in these slide pack that I understand you'll get at the end of today's webinar. So when I'm flicking through the slides, don't panic. It's all good because you'll have a chance to look at those in more detail, and probably say at the outset too that encourage you to call our helpline or visit the Centre's website for more information, and that information again is included in the slide pack at the end. So so just some opening comments on that point. All right, so COVID-19, whether we like it or not, we're here, and whilst a lot of us have probably heard enough of it, it certainly has had a profound impact on all our lives, but certainly for those people living with dementia has some added challenges. And I want to highlight some of the common themes that we've certainly picked up and had feedback from people living with dementia, their families and carers and service providers supporting them. And look, they broadly fall into, did that slide change okay? Can I just check that you're seeing the next slide now? Good. Okay, so broadly they fall into these two different categories. Sudden changes in routine and activities is obviously an issue for anyone who's familiar with someone living with dementia, can create real issues for them in terms of what they're familiar with. And obviously with COVID, that's affected all of our routines, and certainly for people living with dementia, that is no different. So there's a whole lot of anxiety and stress that flows from that for the person living with dementia, their families and carers, and service providers in trying to support them at this difficult time. The second main group that a lot of the issues fall into is obviously the person's ability to understand the issues associated with COVID. What is it? How is it? How it affects what they do on a day-to-day basis, have the understanding the social distancing, the infection control measures, the importance of washing your hands, all of those things have an added complexity when you're someone living with dementia. So given they're the sort of broad areas, some of the common issues that we've had certainly raised with us fall into a number of these sorts of areas in terms of what people experience. I'm not going to go into that in any detail now. As I say, we're a bit pressed for time, but certainly that gives you a sense of some of the issues that are commonly raised for people living with dementia. So I really want to move pretty quickly through to some tips and strategies on this. So there's broadly 5 areas that we've identified that can really help people living with dementia, and probably some specific strategies around each of these. And again, as I was saying in my opening comment, I'm not going to go into the strategies on the following slides against each of these headings, but I do want to just highlight for you that these are the broad areas that we feel that they need that sort of focus to support people. No surprise, the first one is that reduced heightened anxiety, obviously. So the change of routine, the change of the normal way of being, the reduced visitation issues that obviously COVID creates. You know, we've had some really tragic conversations from probably more particularly in residential aged care rather than in the community, but why isn't my daughter visiting? Have I done something to offend her? You know, which is really, you know, I think just in that moment reflects the profound impact that these changes have on someone living with dementia and their capacity to really understand that. So there are some strategies in the following slides which suggest how you can help with that. Maintaining physical health, obviously really important in this context. Obviously, for many people living with dementia, they're in a high risk group and are particularly more vulnerable for those older people living with dementia, recognising that dementia is not solely something that affects older people, but certainly they're in a high risk group. So all of those things about maintaining physical health are important. Promoting social connection, and again, this is one that's obviously been particularly challenged by COVID-19, but we know that as soon as you are diagnosed with dementia, one of the first things people comment on is their loss of friends and how they can quickly drop away. In fact, that's one of the most profound losses people talk about following a diagnosis of dementia. So we know that's an issue without COVID-19, but certainly with the restrictions around visitation in particular, that adds some added challenges, as that little scenario I just gave before, I think really highlights. So how to promote that. And there's some really creative ways that certainly we've seen service providers go about keeping that connection through use of technology, through things like Zoom, through FaceTime, through a whole lot of other ways, even if the person themselves isn't able to use the technology, to be able to support them in being able to do that and access that. Having videos sent to them, having photos and other things sent. Again, probably sometimes with assistance in the use of the technology, because like everyone else, we all have varying levels of capacity around use of technology. And so that's really where we've seen some really great initiatives, I think, by service providers. The next one around engaging activities. So keeping engaged, I think, is a really important piece. We know that normally for people living with dementia, but all of us, if we're not engaged, then there's a whole lot of things that flow from that in terms of the extreme ends, things like depression, anxiety, and if you are more fully engaged, then that certainly makes your life more fulfilling and rewarding. But certainly in the current climate also reduces the extent to which you are likely to dwell on things like what's going on around you. So certainly that's another key piece here. And the fifth one, where we've been doing a lot of work with providers, is about minimising emerging behaviours. Now, behaviours is obviously a common theme that comes up around how you best support someone living with dementia. And most commonly it's reflective of a lack of engagement with the person or effective engagement with them. And so this behaviours is usually a consequence of some kind of unmet need, more often than not. So it's really about trying to identify what that need is and identifying ways to best address it. So this next bit is going to be a bit of a blur. So I'm going to skip through some slides now, which provide some strategies. But as I say, really encourage you to have a look at those following today's session. So you'll see they're listed against reduced heightened anxiety.
I think I'm there now. I can see the speakers. I think I'm in the right spot.
Hi, Gerard. How are you going?
Good. I need to
So,
mute myself.
Yeah, that's right. So look, I'm not going to, as I say, I'm not going to go through these, but certainly, making sure things like you've got regular time is spent with the person, check in with how they're going, and if they have any questions. I know that seems a really simple thing to do, but I can tell you, with all the sort of pressures and focuses that service providers have on their own COVID protocols and other things, it's one of the things that can be the early casualty almost of how you're responding to the COVID piece. So that checking in and taking time to listen to the person, validating how they're feeling, are just some of the things that I've certainly highlighted there. And some of the language we're using around COVID, like lockdown and crisis, they can all be really anxiety provoking for someone. So we need to think particularly carefully about how we're referring to a lot of this. And look, the media love it all. So we get it every day in the media pieces, which is why it's also helpful to try and monitor how much media they're getting, if possible, if they're, or try and direct them at least to some more authoritative pieces of media, but trying to manage that. Because I think if any of us listen to the news every day, I think we'd all be ready to sort out risk by the end of the day if we just, got that constant news stream. Maintaining physical health, so the proper hand hygiene obviously is the fundamental piece around the infection control piece. And a lot of these pieces, it's really about knowing the person that can help with how you best support them around these things, but I'm not going to dwell on these. Promoting that social connection, I mentioned the use of technology as some useful ways that you can really creatively try and assist people in that piece. I should have mentioned before with hand washing, a lot of people are using a song to actually give an indication of how long you need to actually do the washing of the hands. So some really creative YouTube clips as well around that one. Engaging in activities. So again, this is the piece about the more you're engaged, the more you're less likely to focus on some of the anxieties and concerns that are there for people around our current situation. And look, you can have a look at some of this stuff later, but this is just some examples of some of the things that are happening certainly in residential aged care, where hallway bingo, you can see on the left there, where just again through using this sort of social distancing, creative ways of keeping engaged. There's some really great examples highlighted on the media. So the media's been doing some good stuff as well with the window distancing piece, where you visit via and just go outside and have some interaction through the window, and some really creative pieces that are done around that. So really great to see that use of technology being used as a way to really aid that connection. And the final piece here about minimising emerging behaviours. So some of this refers to residential, but certainly in terms of that maintaining a routine as much as possible, it obviously applies to people living in the community. And we have a problem-solving approach we use at Dementia Australia, which I don't have time to go into now, but that CAUSED acronym actually goes through a series of different considerations in how to identify and respond to behaviours. So look, they're probably the 5 key areas. But in closing, probably just the 3 areas I would encourage you to consider whenever you're supporting someone living with dementia. And we know this is, whatever you're thinking about strategies, whatever you're thinking about approaches, your knowledge of that person is absolutely critical. And I'd imagine for a lot of your services, you are familiar with clients who regularly use your transport services. And so don't underestimate the value and importance of that knowledge in knowing how best to support that person at this time. I think your knowledge of the dementia combined with the knowledge of the person can help in appreciating how the dementia affects that particular person, because whilst certainly Alzheimer's is the most common form of dementia, it affects everyone differently. So understanding how that particularly affects them is the second piece to highlight. And the third, and I think probably the most critical, in particular in the current climate, is be flexible in your approach. Some people don't see themselves as being necessarily creative, but be prepared to try some different approaches. And if something's not working, try something else, because I think that's what we've found is worked really well with services and the way they're supporting people at the moment. So just to wrap up, really, if you wanted to talk through any particular individual client concerns, I encourage you to contact our National Dementia Helpline, 1800 100 500. So really, we've got some fantastic staff on that who provide support to families and carers, people living with dementia, and also service providers. So if you see families struggling, really encourage them to also contact the service, because I'd imagine in the pressure's on you. You don't necessarily have that time to actually be there and supporting the family in what you see and identify as a clear need. There is a national coronavirus hotline there as well. And through the centre, we're offering a range of COVID-19 sessions specifically around engagement, but also addressing behaviours through virtual classrooms. So it's a bit more interactive than what we've got today. So we actually have those available to services, and certainly can talk to our staff at the centre if you're interested in any of that. I've enclosed a link which will take you straight to that part of our website. We've also developed a range of help sheets around COVID-19 based on actually the Chinese experience, and then we've just enhanced it from there. So certainly encourage you to use any of those resources in how you're supporting people. And in closing, just want to thank you all for the incredibly important work you do on a daily basis, keeping people connected through the transport services you provide. I know that's vitally important, and even more so in the current environment. So I do want to take the opportunity of really acknowledging you and the valuable work that you do. And back to you, Viv.
Thank you so much, David. I'm just checking in, David, are you able to stay for the full? Great. We will leave questions and answers to the end of the webinar. And Gerard and Pat have now been able to log in as panelists. So we will go to their presentations first, but please log your questions in Q&A. And then during the Q&A session, we will work our way through that for all of the presenters. Pat and I have just introduced ourselves via webinar chat, so I will welcome Pat as the next presenter. Pat is the CEO of Aged and Community Services Australia, and thanks for joining us, Pat. In the interest of time, I'm just going to throw straight to you.
And I think I've been lucky and I've spoken at some of your events before, so thank you for inviting me back. I think I've been a bit too influenced in lockdown by watching Kath and Kim, because I don't have a presentation, so you're going to have to look at Moo. I'm going to give you a bit of a brief overview of the things that have been happening. Some of it will be very familiar to you, but also draw out some of what I think might be the key learnings. And it's quite incredible to think back to January, when there was a bit of a debate about how big this was going to be and what the impacts would really be. And, you know, trying to think about that as a peak body and what that might mean for our members, to where we are now. And I'm sitting in lockdown 2.4 in Melbourne, and the situation is really grim. But I think, you know, if we look at what happened early on in the piece, probably the biggest impact at first was in residential care, and it was around visitor access. And that was something that was the really hot issue, as was supply of PPE. And there were very mixed views, and I was listening with interest to David's presentation around how much we needed to lock down to protect people and stop COVID from coming in. Balancing that with, you know, the mental health and connection piece. And I still don't know whether that's been done 100% accurately, but I think it flagged really early on how difficult this is. You know, we often hear the expression wicked problem, and I think that it gets bandied about all the time now, but that's been my reflection over this. This is really a wicked problem in terms of how much connection you have and how much that compromises health and safety of people. And, you know, I know with my own experience early in the coronavirus, my mum, who's 92, who lives in Adelaide, had what they called an end-of-life event. And I had to hop on the plane from Melbourne, which was very weird. I was on a plane with 7 people. But the whole thing about going on compassionate grounds, and about my mother making a choice, as she did when I left, and she's fine now. But, you know, I had to go into isolation. But at the end, when I left, she wasn't in residential care. She actually said she wanted to hug me. And I said, "Are you sure?" And she was like, "Yes, because I might not see you again, and I have to die of something at some time anyway, darling." So it shows the real difficulty that we have about getting that balance right, but also respecting what it is that the older person themselves, you know, wants out of that. The problem that we've had as residential care providers is that it's not just about the one person. There is a collective responsibility for a whole number of residents within residential care with everything that we do. And I think for me, that's going to be one of the the standouts of this time. It's one of the most difficult things that we've had, but actually as a society, it's probably going to be one of the most strengthening things that we can have. This need to balance individual rights and collective rights and how we do that. And I know I now will never go to work again when I'm sick. When I used to be one of those famous codral soldier on people, and you think now it's also wrong. Why would I have done that? Why did I think that was okay? So I think it's going to change our national psyche, or I hope that it is. So that ongoing issue around visitor access, and David captured a lot of that beautifully about how you keep people connected, is still an issue. And in Victoria now, what we're seeing with many of our members is that the lockdown's continuing for a longer period of time under more restrictive conditions, and the challenge of how you actually do keep people engaged, particularly if people have been confined to their room because there's an outbreak, which may not pass in 14 days, it might actually be a longer period, is how do you do that? And how do you keep people connected? And, you know, to the extent that residents are understandably getting cabin fever and want out, so those behaviours, whether they've got dementia or not, that's starting to come through the longer that situation is in place. So that's going to be one of the next challenges for us. And of course, in home care, it was a different impact. And this is where, you know, community transport's really vital in this. I think one of the sad things that we saw in the home care space was many people feel that they just needed to cancel all of their services because they didn't feel safe using them. And I know that's been difficult for providers in terms of how do you actually support someone who needs the support but is now actually nervous and scared. They didn't want workers to come in who didn't have full PPE on, or at least masks. And in the early stage, the health authorities were saying it's okay to do anything other than really close personal contact with masks, without masks. But as we know now in Victoria, the recommendation is that you must wear a mask outside. So what is also interesting is to see how the advice has changed and what that means for us as providers in terms of keeping ahead of it. So we've been really active with our members, and I hope some of you may have been involved in having regular meetings, debating some of those issues and trying to make sure that we're as prepared as we can be and keep ahead of it. One of the biggest challenges for us in aged care more generally has been the sheer cost on a system that was already struggling. So, you know, home care providers, and you would know this as community transport providers, were doing it tough before COVID, and the costs of COVID have been enormous. The government have put in some measures that offset those costs, but I think what we're also uncovering through this is that the problems that we had in aged care about the adequacy of funding, be that in residential care or in community transport or in home care packages, the adequacy of that funding to do what it is that the community expects and what we want to deliver as providers is not really there. It's probably at its sharpest again at the moment in the ongoing and very public debate about residential aged care and how it's coping with coronavirus. But it exists in home care and CHSP services where most of you would actually get your funding. That we don't have enough funding to do the things that people expect that we can do. So in residential care, and I've been saying this for a long time, I think there's a mismatch between what the community expects is available in residential care and what we're actually funded to deliver. And I think it's the same in home care packages, the amount of support that people are actually able to get as opposed to how it's promoted and what they can get sets us up for a mismatch. So I think it's a terrible tragedy what's happening at the moment, and we're really conscious and thinking about those families who've lost a loved one, and the impact that it's having on people who can't see their loved ones is terrible. But if any good can come from this, it has to be that it's shining a light on what we need to do in aged care and how we need to be funded and how we as a community need to support older people in a better way. If we get some good shift as a result of that, then it will have been a contribution to that end. I don't want to rabbit on too much. I'm really interested in the questions that people will have. Probably to wrap up by saying I think that one of the unfortunate things around COVID is it has largely focused on residential aged care, both the government supports and also the community debate, and it has left home care a little bit not in the spotlight. So the issues that you've experienced in community transport or that people will have had as CHSP have largely not been looked at. And I think it is a problem that we continue to advocate for, that there is support needed and communications and additional resources for consumers of home care services that just haven't been there. And that's an ongoing challenge. And I think that what we're seeing now is that, and what tragically has played out in Victoria, is that as community restrictions ease, our clients, whether they're in home or living in residential care, are at more risk, and it's going to be with us for some time to come. And we actually need to do more in this whole home care transport space about making sure that people are supported and can use the services that they need. And I'll be really keen to hear your thoughts and to link in with you as we continue to have these conversations with government and with the community about what it is that we need to do. So I might leave it at that so that we get lots of time for questions.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Pat. And that whole, the whole area of funding and the fact that COVID has unleashed the weaknesses of the system that many of us have been talking about for a long time.
For a long time.
For a very, very long time, yeah. And I know, as the community transport provider, that transition period out of COVID is probably more fraught for us than the period in COVID, when government is recognising that there might be some additional resources. But when we transition out and people may not want to go back to all those social and recreational pursuits that they did, and government's saying, well, we're over it, that's going to be really critical. And I think you've really highlighted that for us. So I also look forward to the questions and answers at the end around those issues. So thanks, Pat. Can I now welcome Gerard, Mansour, yes, Gerard's back on, who is the Commissioner for Senior Victorians. Welcome, Gerard, and I shall throw straight to your presentation.
Thanks very much, Viv, and apologies for my little bit of humour. I might have added a bit of a YouTube clip there at the start. So I only had about 4 links before I found the right one. I think you'll find I've registered about 4 times for your session. Thanks, Viv. So I was quite unsuccessful. Look, I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're meeting on today, and their elders past and present, and any emerging elders that are with us today. Not everybody knows a lot about my role and some of the recent changes. So as Commissioner for Senior Victorians, my type of commissioner role is a bit different to a lot of other commissioners. So I don't deal with individual complaints. I've sort of got a longer term policy role, and a couple of examples of that. In 2016, I published a report on isolation and loneliness of older people. And of course, you won't be surprised, in that report highlighted the importance of community transport. And the real critically reality that for lots of older people as they age, we all know that they circulate more and more around the community that they live in. So community transport's an essential part of addressing isolation and loneliness of older people. And later this year, I'll publish a report on what it means to age well, and a lot of the methodology that I use, and in a normal world, not in a COVID world, I would spend about half of my time out with older people in the communities that they live in, just understanding the issues, what's working well, what are some of the challenges they're facing. And of course, I feel like I've lost my arms and legs at the moment, that I can't have the type of interactions with senior Victorians that I would have had in the past. And just in the last few days, I've been asked by the 2 ministers, Minister Colbeck from a federal perspective, and Minister Denellen, who is Minister for Ageing, and my advice into the Victorian government goes through Minister Denellen, to play some sort of advisory role for the Victorian Aged Care Response Centre. So I remain in my current role, and it's very much an advisory type responsibility, focusing on some of the challenges that we've seen occur with families and communication with families. And we're operating in a very different world. And in the next week, I'll take a bit of time, and had an opportunity to chat with Patricia yesterday, with Sean Rooney and others, Craig Gear from OPAN, to catch up very quickly on how the providers see the world. It's a long time. since I've had a chance to have a bit of a deep dive, particularly into residential care. Most of my work is at a community level and much more focused on home care issues and things like that. So that's just a bit of a snapshot about the work that I've been doing. In terms of today, I wanted to make a couple of observations about where I think older people are psychologically. And I think one of the traps a lot of our community has is to try to parcel older people in a box, and they have a perception about an older person fulfilling in a particular role in a particular place. And they may at the moment have a lot of visual images of older people living in residential aged care. They'll have a lot of images from the media about the role of families and the consternation that exists. And it puts us, I think, in a little bit of a tinderbox issue, because of course the whole journey of life doesn't stop. And the people who were getting to the point of living at home and being a bit more frail and needed support still need that. And so how's our system in the short term responding to that is particularly challenging. And I think older people, of course, are along a really long continuum. Some of the first people out in Victoria when we move back out of stage 4 and go back into stage 3 and hopefully stage 2 and stage 1, some of the first people back out will be older people. And some of those will be younger older people, some of them will be middle-aged, and some people in their 80s and 90s. So we can't have any fixed image mentally of where older people sit along that continuum. And I think that's a really important thing to remember as we move hopefully towards some changes in the not too distant future, if fingers crossed we can get on top of the COVID. But I'd like to pick up where Viv was sort of going to in how are older people likely to move back out of the environment that we're in. And I think there's a couple of observations I'd like to make. And the first is that some will very quickly move back to the things they would be doing. They'd be itching to go back to their social activity groups. They'd be itching to reconnect with the University of the Third Age, with their men's sheds. So some people will just be out there quickly. They're very, very resilient. Their underpinning health is there. They've been taking the opportunities to walk every day. They're following the instructions and they're pretty much in control. So there'll be a lot of older people that are in that situation. And then there'll be a middle group. And I think this is quite a large group, and I think it's very difficult to get a sense of how many people sit in this category who are what I'd call overly conservative now. So they've heard a lot of messages about COVID's impact on older people. And they've heard a lot about age 65. They probably haven't delineated the subtle messages that it's a particular group of people over 65, particularly those over 70 with underpinning health conditions. And of course, people of any ages, as we know with COVID, it's just not affecting older people while they're clearly the dominant group. It's more about the underpinning health issues. So I think there are a whole lot of older people that are overly conservative now, who see themselves as at risk, and quite possibly they're not. And I think as community transport providers, that's one of the things that we all need to think about, is how are we going to communicate and interact with those people to rebuild confidence as we get to the importance of people being able to move around the community again. And then there's the people at much higher levels of need at home, the people that Patricia was referring to, who maybe have deferred parts of their home care package, have real concerns about visitors and even their own family members coming into the home, who are reluctant now maybe to embrace engagement with their own children or their own grandchildren or their own great-grandchildren. So I think there's some of the continuum issues that I see that we're going to move into. So a lot of my thinking has been about how is that going to evolve and what type of resources and support older people might need. Some of the work that I'll publish shortly in my report about what it means to age well, I think sets an interesting context, because there are a lot of older people who see aging well as a really positive, resilient journey. But very often, and one of the most common words that came up when I said to the groups of older people that I consulted with, tell me, what would you say are some of the challenges about getting older? Very interestingly, the most common word was the word invisibility. That there's a sense that as people get older, the community doesn't value them quite in the same way anymore. And it was interesting, in one of the media interviews, that was the very question that got asked. Do I think that our community in the current situation values older people less than if we had all the deaths we've got of younger people rather than older people, would the community react differently? And my answer was, I don't think so. I think for one of the few times that I've been in my role, I think there is a real heightened community awareness of trying to protect older people. There's a sense that older people have contributed a lot to life. I might be misreading that. I'm saying that from my upstairs lounge room, and I don't have a chance to validate that in the same way. But my sense is when I listen to talkback, listen to community conversations, the sort of things that are happening, that there is a real sense that we're in this together, and that there is an awareness that older people are some of the most vulnerable people. And so we've all got to do something to protect each other, but that also means protecting the older people who are more frail and vulnerable. So I think that, you know, maybe there's the beginning of an attitudinal change there. I might be wrong, but I think that there is an unconscious bias in ageism that takes place. And one of the things that I did learn through my report that I'll talk a lot more about later on is I think what happens individually, we have like an internalized ageism that often stops older people reaching out for support. One of the things that puzzled me that I explored in this conversation is why often if you talk to an older person who's now got a walker frame, they'll often say to me that actually I knew I needed that walker frame 2 or 3 years ago. And I've tried to get a better understanding of the psyche that sits below that. And I think it's a little bit about internalized ageism, that we all find it difficult to accept the fact that we need support one day, and that we see it and we look through the lens of loss. I'm losing my independence. I'm going to lose my driver's license. And I think that's part of the conversation that we've got to reposition. And I think in a funny sort of way, that's the conversation that community transport providers are going to find they're moving into. How do we see community transport, access to social groups as fulfilling a really important need of people connecting and being with each other if older people are in an overly conservative mindset and worried about their health? And tied in with that is this sense of people not really necessarily coming to terms with easily that getting support and assistance, having a home care package is actually an enabler of their support. And with older people, I learned in fact that there's 2 waiting lists. There's one waiting list which we know is over 100,000 people, that's the Commonwealth waiting list. But there's also what I call a personal waiting list. There's the period of time it takes for us as an individual from when we're starting to recognise that we need support, that we actually get to the point of putting our hand up and seeking that support. Now that can be 2, 3, 4, 5 years. It can be a much longer period of time than the Commonwealth's waiting list period of time. And so there's some of the things that I'm going to get to in my report when I publish it later this year. But I think they're very, very relevant issues now as we think about what's the world going to be like for older people as they reconnect to the world, hopefully in the not too distant future in an environment where we can start communicating and connecting again. Thank you.
Thank you, Gerard. That poses some very wide and issues for us to think about in community transport, because often it's our volunteers who are going into the homes and seeing some of the deterioration in the health status of people. They're seeing family interactions, and it's a real challenge in how we as community transport providers actually respond to that and those emerging changes when we're responding through the eyes of volunteers in particular. So I think, you know, there are some really big discussion issues for us there. So thank you to all 3 of you. We are entering a Q&A session now, and people can either log their question via the Q&A function, is probably the easiest, or you know, you can, I'm assuming, pipe in with your question as well. I'd ask people to keep the questions reasonably short so that everyone can have a say. We do have one question that was logged whilst David was presenting. David, with loved ones in nursing homes, this provides greater challenges to family members to keep that contact. Any suggestions here? And I guess that can be open to Pat and Gerard as well.
Look, and I'm conscious we're pressed for time, but certainly I'll direct you to a lot of the tip sheets we have on our website. There's a wealth of suggestions from that. We ran all through April community of practice, specifically for workers in aged care. And we actually kind of mined their fantastic ideas, I have to say, they had both in community aged care but also in residential aged care. Just some really great, clever ideas. Doesn't have to involve technology. I mean, I made reference to some technology use before, but yeah, just some really good ideas about how you can connect with people and try and keep that engagement piece I was saying before, because I think the engagement bit is just so critical, because if that's not happening, then that unmet need starts to potentially bubble through in behaviours. And so then you see the focus on, well, how do we change these behaviours? Well, actually, it's not the behaviours you should be focusing on. It's actually why someone is responding in the way that they are, is often invariably around that engagement piece. But look, there's a whole heap of strategies there. If you've got particular queries with someone you're providing community transport for, really encourage you to call our helpline, because I think we don't have time to sort of unpack the particular person and the circumstance. And I think it's worth doing that rather than just throwing out a whole lot of tips and strategies, because I think it does help to really bring to that your knowledge of the person.
Great, thank you for that. We have another question here in regards to elder abuse, and obviously because of the stresses of this time, there is more risk of elder abuse, and our volunteer drivers and community transport may well be the ones who are witnessing that. Do you have any suggestions about how to manage that in this challenging time? So and that's an open question to any of you.
So one of the things that I didn't talk about, Viv, part of my role as well after the announcement of the Family Violence Royal Commission, one of the things the Victorian government asked me to do is to play a role in terms of elder abuse prevention. And so they come up with the title Ambassador for Elder Abuse Prevention, but it was really asking me to play a role in I spend a lot of the time out in community conversations, often talk with older people about that experience. And it's interesting, I think it's very similar with that and mental health issues. I also every time I sort of do a government submission of some form, wherever I can, I get groups of older people together to inform me about that. And when I was doing the one recently around mental health and my submission to the Victorian Royal Commission, it became clear that often older people disclose issues like elder abuse and mental health, in fact, to people like a volunteer on a community transport. They can often be the very first person. It could be a podiatrist, it could be a hairdresser. Lots of older people are so reluctant because they'll particularly if it's an adult child, that we know that's one of the most common forms of abuse. Where it's an adult child, of course, they're owning it as failure of their own parenting. And so it's very difficult if you see that you're the cause of your own abuse. And so that's one of the early things that people have got to get through, an older person. And I think the other is a generational thing. Maybe the baby boomers will be a bit different, but I think, the people that came through the post-war era, there's so much of an attitude, just get on with it. That's my lot in life, just deal with it, and so I think they're two real hurdles. And so often a volunteer in a community transport situation may be the very first person. And so things like the Respect Victoria campaign recently, where there's little brochures that have been pocket size or wallet size brochures, are often very useful resources to give those to an older person. They're still available through Respect Victoria. And so to say, look, there is support available. Here's a bit of an explanation, and so that an older person can look at a document and say, well, actually, what I'm experienced, that is abuse. That I can see that in that document there, and so that they can ring Seniors Rights Victoria or a community legal service or approach a provider like the provider more formally. So often that's the journey of disclosure will come through someone like a volunteer in the first place.
Can I just add to that it's great that there's the brochures for the older person, but we also produced a free resource, which is a pocket brochure for brochure for services, which is what you might look for to see, to sort of pick up if you think that a client is being abused. It works, it's for residential and all community services. They are available free. We can just send them out to you. So if you would like them, it's written in really plain English, folds out, and it says if you notice any of these signs, or if people say these kinds of things to you, you know, you might want to talk to someone about, is the person being abused? So we're really happy to get you some of those if you let us know how many you'd like.
That would be great, Pat. So perhaps through Suzanne, because we've got quite a few people on chat going, can we get our hands on these, please? Yes.
Absolutely.
Viv, if I can just add to that, probably from a dementia perspective, there is a great resource online now that the National Ageing Research Institute have produced around identifying and responding to elder abuse involving people living with dementia, and just a really excellent series of very, very short online videos that you can view that are really designed to provide service providers with some really useful strategies about how to sort of pick up and best respond to the issue for exactly the reasons that Gerard mentioned. I think for very often the demographic affected by this is, you know, they don't want to shame the family, they feel embarrassed, they feel they should suck it up and just deal with it. They're afraid that might affect the limited social connections they may have already experienced as a result of living with dementia in the community. So, you know, when they've been reduced, the extent to which you want to reduce it even further, even though they're abusive relationships, is a really difficult decision for people to make in that context, particularly when their cognition is impaired and affected as well.
Great. Thank you, all three of you, for that, for those comments. We've got a number of comments coming through around the fact that this is the first day of stage 4 workplace restrictions, and our colleagues on the border are having really interesting experiences about crossing from Victoria to New South Wales. And also, you know, there are some challenges in Tasmania, and I know we have Lyndon Stevenson here, who is the chair of ACTA and also chair of the Victorian Tasmania Community Transport Association. So I might put Lyndon on the spot here and ask, you know, what is the feedback around how people are dealing with COVID-4 restrictions. But I'd like to preface that with something that Pat raised earlier, which is around working together. You know, we all understand the role of community transport, but in Victoria, we have a particular issue in that the Victorian government doesn't recognise it funds community transport. So in this current COVID period, it was giving money to taxis and Uber, but not to the community transport providers who were actually transporting the vulnerable clients, and still are. And so I do, you know, it's more a comment than a question, Pat, but we do have to come together around that, because that is a fundamental issue. If we are invisible in Victoria, then that is going to impact vulnerable people coming out of COVID. I'll leave that as a comment, but it does pick up on that need for all of us to work together around that.
Yeah.
Lyndon, can I throw to you just to give a comment around, you know, the feedback around how COVID-4 in Victoria is starting to impact.
No, thanks, Viv. And just quickly, thanks to all the speakers today. It's been great sitting back and listening to you present. So look, Tasmania, I guess, is let's say fortunate at the moment. You know, we've all gone through this challenge much earlier in the year, and we were dealing with it. And of course, things have changed in Victoria. So I guess what's happening in Tasmania is pretty much what we set out to do in April and in March, April and May. We are seeing the demand for the service starting to increase, although when the media from Victoria hits the papers and the radio in Tasmania, you do see a little dip. So that's quite interesting. We are, the demand is growing, but of course with the physical distancing, there is going to come that time too where that's going to be a challenge on resources. But at this stage, I think providers collectively are meeting the demand with the physical distancing requirements. And I guess one of the things we're doing as providers in Tasmania, and of course as state peaks and as the national peak, is just reminding government that the cost for the service isn't going to get any cheaper. In actual fact, the cost will remain the same and probably be slightly more with the additional cost for COVID safe measures, and the impact's going to be much less, although very important, because obviously with one consumer in a vehicle, the cost stays the same, but the impact spread changes dramatically, and of course the revenue providers changes dramatically as well. So that's a point at a national peak that we're making very clearly over the next few weeks, and that really feeds into, again, with block funding and the funding models moving forward. Once we start playing around with critical infrastructure, which we're all talking about and agreeing with today, once we start playing around with funding models, then choice. Is choice the most important thing at the moment, or is making sure there are providers that are, compliant, appropriately resourced on the road so they can provide that regular transport? And I guess one of the main learnings has been that throughout COVID, demand for community services has been there. Even in the heights of it, even in the worst of it, people still need to get out and about. And if you have a model where the funding is out in the community, those that have the allocation of funding that may not need it at that particular time, and then you have consumers that do need it but need more of the funding, but it's locked up in other areas, then the infrastructure is not there and the service is not there. And of course, you end up having a risk, as a transport provider, the tension: do you actually try to promote transport to keep vehicles on the road to keep the cash flow, and create infection risk? It's a real challenge. So I guess, in summary, the demand's still there. We know that it is going to be a challenge moving forward to meet that demand with the physical distancing and managing the expectation at government that the cost isn't going to get cheaper with a reduction in people using the service.
Viv, I've just seen the question there about metro transport operators still providing services. My understanding would be that they can, where it's to take someone shopping or to a medical appointment, but really not for any other, purpose.
Yeah. And that's certainly the way we've read it at Eastern Volunteers, and we've certainly defined transport in the metro area as only for essential health and medical, where the health service has deemed that a face-to-face consultation is necessary.
Yeah.
Because that then enables us to understand as community transport providers the risk. So health have already done an assessment of risk, and therefore we are able to provide transport. But we've certainly gone right down to
and I think that's really responsible, and I'm aware of businesses, my cleaning service, for example, who told me that they would still come tomorrow. And I said, I don't think you will be coming because you're not supposed to be. So it's really important that we all adhere to those guidelines. And of course, I'm sure you're all across needing to have the permits for your workers and your volunteers.
Yeah, and that's sort of an evolving space in terms of the permits as well. And because a lot of the delivery is through volunteers, that's also been a challenge in community transport, is how do you ask your volunteers to continue to drive? And so it's raised a whole lot of issues around choice. Certainly a lot of the volunteers, as we know, were over 65. So, community transport services have experienced the need to replace their volunteer workforces. And those volunteer workforces are often replaced by people who can no longer work and who are now volunteering, but will eventually go back to work. So, there's some of the challenges of transition as well. In that we've still got to maintain a volunteer workforce. There is one last question around, how people are coping, particularly in Northeast Victoria, around managing during COVID. I'm not going to focus on that message, because I think there is an argument for us to come together sometime in the next few weeks as community transport providers to talk about some of those bigger issues, and particularly the issues around transition and funding. And how we work together as a group of peaks, you know, particularly I'm looking at Pat here, and Gerard and David, you know, in terms of how we actually pool our collective influence to address what is the most fundamental issue in Victoria, the invisibility of community transport. And
I think that's a really good point. I mean, the other thing that I would say that we've seen governments do over the last little while is be much more flexible. So they put more flexibility into the CHSP system and how providers could respond. And I think one of the things that we want to do is make sure that some of those things that have happened in COVID, that we don't lose them once we come out of it, because what we've seen is that the system's been able to be more responsive to people. So I think it's really important that we work together on that front as well about increasing the flexibility.
Lovely, thank you. May I draw this to a close? Thank you to David, to Pat and to Gerard for providing a terribly meaningful webinar. It was fabulous. I know David's got to leave us now for another meeting. I would say to everyone, thank you for joining us. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay sane. And we will be in communication with Transport, our members very shortly around where we're going in August to start to crunch some of those really important issues around funding.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me, and I think community transport's really amazing what you do. So any way we can work together, we're here.
Absolutely. Thanks, Pat. Thanks, Gerard.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.